Claire stepped out of her office just as the last drops of rain fell against the streets of Seattle. The city looked washed clean, glimmering under the streetlights, but inside her things still felt heavy. Work had been endless meetings and deadlines, and at home, the silence between her and Mark had become louder than words. It wasn't anger or resentment, just distance. The kind of quiet that builds when two people start living side by side instead of together. When she pulled into the driveway, she noticed the lights were dim and the curtains were drawn. She thought Mark had already gone to bed, but when she opened the door, soft music greeted her. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken, her favorite. Candles flickered across the table, and a bottle of red wine stood open beside two glasses. "Mark?" She called out, setting her bag down, unsure what to expect. He appeared from the kitchen, holding a dish towel, smiling like a man trying too hard to pretend he wasn't nervous. "Hey, you're home." "Perfect timing." She blinked. "What's all this?" He shrugged lightly. "You've been buried in work. I thought we could use a quiet night. Just us." Claire's chest softened. She couldn't remember the last time he'd done something spontaneous. They'd fallen into routines, and romance had quietly slipped out the back door. Maybe this was his way of pulling it back in. "You did all this?" she asked, walking closer. He grinned. "I might have had some help from YouTube recipes, but yeah, I tried." She laughed, the sound catching even her off guard. "You did good." Dinner started easy. They talked about their days, about things that didn't matter but still somehow did. The warmth of the food, the sound of rain starting again outside, and the quiet jazz filling the space. It almost felt like the early days again. The part of their marriage where everything felt new and exciting. But every few minutes, Mark's eyes flicked toward the clock. Then his phone. Then the front door. Claire noticed but didn't say anything. She wanted to believe this was about them, not something else. "You seem distracted," she said finally, setting her glass down. Mark's fork paused midair. "Do I? You've checked the time at least 5 times. He hesitated. Then he smiled again too icily. "Actually, there's one more part to this surprise." Before she could ask, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the calm like thunder. Mark stood. "I'll get it," she frowned. "You invited someone." He didn't answer. He just walked to the door, and a moment later, Claire heard a voice she hadn't heard in 10 years. "Hi, Mark." Her heart stopped. It couldn't be Dot. When Mark stepped aside, the man who walked in made time feel like it had turned backward. David. The name rushed through her mind before she could even process it. The man she'd once thought she would marry before everything changed. He looked almost the same, older. Yes, but still carrying that calm, quiet strength that had once drawn her in. He smiled, uncertain but warm. "Hey, Claire." Her lips parted, but words failed. "David, what are you doing here?" Mark closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "I ran into him a few weeks ago. Turns out he's back in town. Thought it'd be nice for you two to catch up." Catch up? As if this were some casual dinner with an old friend and not a collision between the past and the present. "I hope this isn't too much of a shock," David said, his voice gentle. Mark thought it would be good to see each other again. Claire forced a polite smile. "It's unexpected." She sat down again, her hands trembling slightly as Mark poured more wine. The air felt thick, too full of everything unspoken. "So," Mark began, trying to sound cheerful, "I figured we could all have dinner together. Like old times, kind of." Tava chuckled softly. "Except none of us are the same people anymore." The way he said it, calm, almost wistful, made Claire's chest tighten. She could feel the weight of the past between them. Invisible but real. Mark asked questions about David's job, where he'd been living, but Claire could barely hear them. She was too busy remembering. The way David used to laugh, the way he'd made her feel like the world could be bigger than it was. But she'd chosen Mark, the man who stayed steady when everything else fell apart. At one point, she excused herself to the kitchen, needing to breathe. She leaned against the counter, heart racing. What was happening? Why had Mark done this? She didn't have to wait long to find out. David followed her. "You look like you need a moment." quietly, standing in the doorway. Claire didn't turn around. I just didn't expect this. I didn't either. Mark said you might not want to see me. I wasn't sure if I should come. You shouldn't have, she said, but her voice trembled. David stepped closer. Not too close, just enough for his voice to lower. You look happy, Claire. Different. She turned then, meeting his eyes. Do I? He nodded. You always wanted peace. Looks like you found it. Peace. The word felt ironic, because in that moment she felt anything but. Before she could respond, Mark's voice called from the dining room, too cheerful to be natural. You two okay in there? Claire blinked, stepped away from the counter, and forced her tone steady. Yeah, just grabbing more wine. Back at the table, the air felt heavier. Mark was smiling, but his eyes were sharp, watching her closely. She couldn't tell if he was testing her or protecting something. David told stories about his travels, about building a business, about life in small towns that didn't know his name. She listened quietly, her mind slipping between now and then. Finally, Mark lifted his glass. To the past for what it taught us, and to the present for giving us another chance to appreciate it. Claire clinked her glass, her hand trembling slightly. David's eyes met hers across the table, not longing, just understanding. And in that small, silent exchange, she realized something had shifted. This wasn't just a dinner. It was something else, a reckoning. Mark was watching, and she could feel it. He'd brought David here for a reason, and deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. When the night ended and David said goodbye at the door, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that her husband hadn't just planned a dinner he'd opened a door she thought had been locked forever. And as the candles flickered lower, she wondered which one of them had really started it, because sometimes love doesn't fade quietly. It hides, waiting for one moment, one knock on the door to come alive again. The next morning, Claire woke up with the faint smell of last night's candles still lingering in the house. Mark had already left for work, leaving behind a note on the counter that said, "Thanks for last night. Hope it wasn't too strange. We needed that." She read it twice, not sure if he meant we as in their marriage or we as in all three of them. Her coffee sat untouched as her mind replayed the night. David's calm eyes, the way he still said her name gently, the awkward tension that hung between all three of them. Why would Mark invite him? He had never even liked David back when she and Mark started dating. It didn't make sense. At work, she couldn't focus. Every email looked blurry and every phone call felt like background noise. When she stepped outside during lunch, she saw a familiar figure leaning against a black car near the corner cafe. David. He looked up and smiled softly, like he'd expected her. "Hey," he said, hands in his pockets. "Didn't think you'd see me?" She crossed her arms, unsure if she should be angry or confused. "Why are you here?" He shrugged. "I was nearby. Thought maybe we could talk? Properly this time." She hesitated. "It's not a good idea." Maybe not," he said. "But I feel like Mark wanted something last night. I just don't know what." That made her pause. "You felt that too?" He nodded. "He watched you the whole night. It wasn't jealousy, though. It was something else, like he was testing something." Claire sighed. "Mark's been distant for months. Maybe he thought seeing you would remind me of what I have." David smiled sadly. "Or maybe he thought seeing me would remind him what he's risking." They sat at a table outside the cafe, keeping things light at first. They talked about small memories, college days, mutual friends, where life had taken them. But beneath every word was the ghost of what once was. Claire had moved on, built a life, married a man who had been her safe harbor. Yet sitting across from David now, Sku couldn't ignore how alive she suddenly felt. "I never apologized," David said quietly, "for leaving without saying goodbye." Claire looked at him. "You didn't owe me one. We were both young. We made choices. But you didn't make that one," he replied gently. "I did, and I regretted it for years." She didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't open old wounds. After coffee, he walked her back toward her car. "If you ever want to talk again, I'm around." No expectations, he said, handing her his number on a small card. She slipped it into her bag without comment and drove home, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. That evening, Mark was home early. He greeted her with a calm smile, almost too calm. "How was work?" "Busy," she replied. "You?" "Fine," he said, stirring the pasta on the stove. "David texted me. Said he saw you today?" Claire froze. "He told you?" "Yeah," Mark said without looking up. He thought it might be weird not to mention it. "He's a decent guy, Claire. Always was." She couldn't tell if that was sarcasm or sincerity. "You don't seem surprised." He turned then, his eyes steady. "I'm not. I wanted this." "You needed to see him again." "Why would I need that?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Because you've been unhappy," he said simply. "I see it, even if you don't say it. You've been here, but not here. I thought maybe facing whatever was left in the past would bring you back." Claire didn't know whether to be grateful or angry. "So you invited my ex to dinner to fix our marriage?" He smiled faintly. "Something like that." She shook her head. "You can't just, 'I can when I love you,'" he said quietly. "And I do. But love isn't about pretending nothing's broken. It's about facing what is." The honesty in his tone made her pause. Mark wasn't cruel or controlling, he was scared. Scared of losing her without understanding why. Later that night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie neither was really following, she felt him reach for her hand. It was the same hand she used to hold tightly when things were new and easy. She squeezed back, but her mind still drifted to the coffee shop. To David's words, to the version of herself she'd been when she'd loved freely, without fear. The following days blurred together, a mix of normal routine and quiet confusion. Then, on Thursday, another message came. Not from Mark this time, from David. "There's something you should know." About Mark. Her pulse quickened. "What about him?" She replied a few seconds later. David responded. "He called me before that dinner. Said he wanted to ask me for a favor. I didn't understand it then, but now I think you should." "What kind of favor?" She typed back, but before he could answer, Mark walked into the room. "Who's that?" he asked casually, setting down his briefcase. She locked her phone quickly. "Just work stuff." He smiled faintly. "Right?" That night she barely slept. Her mind spun with questions. What favor? Why had Mark really brought David back into their lives? By morning, she couldn't take the silence anymore. She sent another message. "Meet me at the park this afternoon. I need to know." When she arrived, the leaves were beginning to turn gold. David was waiting by the lake, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Maybe not," he agreed. "But you need to hear this." He handed her a folded paper and old photograph, she realized. It was of Mark and her years ago, on their wedding day. But behind them, standing a little off to the side, was David. "I took that picture," he said softly. "Mark asked me to. He said he wanted the man who once loved you to be the one who captured the moment he promised to never let you go." Claire's eyes widened. "He asked you that?" David nodded. "He said love isn't about winning. It's about being chosen, even when you could have been someone else's." Her throat tightened. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because maybe you forgot," he said gently. "And maybe he thought reminding you would help you remember." She stood there, staring at the water, realizing that all this time, Mark hadn't been trying to test her heart. He'd been trying to heal it. David smiled, small and sad. "He loves you, Claire, deeply. The kind of love that forgives even the memories that hurt." Her eyes stung. "And you?" He looked away. "I'll always care for you. But maybe this time, it's not my story to finish." When she drove home that evening, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in gold. Mark was sitting on the porch waiting. She didn't speak right away. She just sat beside him, their shoulders touching, their silence saying what words couldn't. He turned slightly. "So, did you find what you were looking for?" She smiled faintly through tears. "No, but I remembered what I already had." And for the first time in months, she leaned into him. Not out of habit, but out of love. The morning after that emotional evening, the air in the house felt lighter, almost peaceful. Claire woke up to the sound of Mark humming in the kitchen, something he hadn't done in months. For a brief moment, she let herself enjoy it, the smell of coffee. The sound of the toast popping, the simple comfort of routine. But even as she smiled, her thoughts drifted back to David's words. She couldn't shake the image of that old wedding photo. The way Mark had included him wasn't an accident, it was a message. But what exactly was Mark trying to tell her by bringing David back now? Mark looked up when she entered. "You look rested," he said, setting a plate on the table. "I slept," she replied. "Not perfectly, but better." He smiled faintly. "That's something." They ate quietly, but the silence wasn't tense anymore, it was thoughtful. After breakfast, Mark said he had to run an errand and left in his truck. Claire stayed behind, staring at the window as rain began to tap against the glass. She felt the pull of the past and the comfort of the present, two worlds that refused to blend. Around noon, her phone buzzed. A message from David. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday." Her pulse skipped. "What do you mean?" She typed back. "Meet me at the old bookstore. It's important." She hesitated. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity outweighed caution. An hour later, she found herself walking down Main Street. Her coat wrapped tightly around her as the rain turned into a soft drizzle. The bookstore was quiet, almost empty, filled with the smell of paper and old wood. David stood in one of the aisles holding a familiar blue notebook. "You kept that?" she asked, surprised. "It's yours," he said softly, handing it to her. "You gave it to me before I left for New York. I thought you might want it back." She took it carefully. Inside were pages of handwritten letters, words she'd written to him years ago, but never sent. Some were about love, some about dreams, and some about fear. She hadn't realized he'd kept them all this time. "I never read past the first few pages," David said. "It felt like opening something sacred. But when Mark called me, he mentioned this notebook." She frowned. "Mark knew about it." David nodded. "He said if I still had it, I should give it to you when the time felt right. He thought maybe it would remind you of who you were before everything got heavy." Claire blinked, confused. "He said that?" "Yes," David said gently. "He's not trying to compete with the past, Claire. He's trying to help you forgive it." Her throat tightened. "I don't know if I can." "Then start small," David said. "Forgive yourself first." She ran her fingers over the faded ink on the pages. The handwriting looked younger, freer. She remembered writing those words late at night, full of hope and fear, never knowing how things would end. Now they felt like echoes of another life. When she looked up, David was watching her quietly. "You've changed," he said, "but not in a bad way. You're stronger now." She smiled faintly. "Stronger doesn't always mean happier." He nodded. "Maybe, but happiness doesn't come from the past. It comes from what you choose now." They walked together outside where the rain had stopped. The clouds were clearing, sunlight breaking through. It felt symbolic, like the world was exhaling after holding its breath. "I think this is goodbye," Claire said softly. "Yeah," David replied, though his voice was tender. "It's time." Before partying, he said, "Mark's a good man. Don't lose him trying to fix something that was never broken." She watched him leave, disappearing down the quiet street. There was sadness in it, but also peace. She knew this was the last time she'd see him. When she returned home, Ike was on the porch again, waiting with 2 mugs of coffee. "Rain caught you?" he asked casually. "A little," she said, sitting beside him. He looked at her with that calm, patient gaze that had always steadied her. "You saw him again, didn't you?" She didn't lie. "Yes, he gave me something, my old notebook." "He said you told him to." Mark nodded. "I did." "Why?" she asked softly. "Why bring back all that pain?" He sighed. "Because you never really let it go. I could see it in your eyes. You smiled, but something in you stayed guarded. I thought if you faced him, you could finally breathe again." Her eyes filled with tears. You knew I'd meet him again? I hoped you would, he said. And I hoped you'd come back different. She looked down at the notebook in her lap. You did all this just for that? I did it for us, he said. I don't want a version of you that's half here. I want all of you. His words broke something open inside her. She leaned against him, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to. He smiled softly. Now you do. The sun dipped low behind the trees as they sat together, the golden light painting their faces. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was healing. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, flipping through the notebook again. Each letter felt like a time capsule filled with dreams she'd outgrown and fears she'd finally faced. On the last page, she found something she didn't remember writing, a note addressed to my future self. It said, "When you find this, I hope you're with someone who loves you enough to let you heal, even if it means facing what hurts. Don't forget, love isn't about holding on. It's about learning when to open your hands." She smiled through tears. That younger version of herself had already known what she needed to hear now. The next morning, she placed the notebook on Mark's nightstand with a note. You were right. I'm ready to be here. All of me. When Mark woke up and found it, he walked into the kitchen where Claire stood by the window. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled her into his arms. She didn't resist. The embrace was quiet, steady, full of everything they'd left unsaid. Later, as they made breakfast together, Mark glanced at her and said, "There's one more thing I planned." She raised an eyebrow. More surprises. "Maybe," he said with a smile. "Dinner tonight. Just you and me. No ghosts, no guests." She laughed softly, the sound genuine this time. "I think I'd like that." By evening, the house was filled with soft music again, but this time the air felt different. The past no longer lingered in the corners. It had been acknowledged, respected, and released as they ate. Mark reached across the table and said, "You know, when I opened that door to your past, I wasn't sure if I was making a mistake." Claire smiled. "Maybe you didn't open a door," she said gently. "Maybe you just helped me close one." And for the first time in a long while, they both laughed free, easy, and whole. The night Mark had planned finally arrived. The house glowed softly under the golden light of candles scattered around the living room. It wasn't extravagant, just quiet, warm, and real. Claire wore a simple navy dress, one she hadn't touched in years. When she looked in the mirror before walking downstairs, she barely recognized herself. There was something different in her reflection piece, maybe, or something close to it. Mark was in the kitchen, finishing dinner when she appeared. He turned, paused, and smiled the way he used to when they first met. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "You cleaned up pretty well yourself." He laughed softly, tension easing between them. As they sat down, the music playing in the background carried an old melodious song they used to dance to before life got too busy. Before silence became their common language. The table was simple. Pasta, wine, and 2 candles flickering between them. Yet it felt like more than a meal. It felt like the start of something new. After a few bites, Mark spoke. "When I reached out to David, I was scared," he admitted. "Not of losing you, but of realizing how much you'd already lost yourself." Claire looked up, surprised by his honesty. "You weren't wrong," she said quietly. "I didn't even realize how much of me had faded until he showed up again. But you helped me remember who I was, not who I used to be." He nodded, his eyes gentle. "That's all I wanted. I didn't want to erase your past, Claire. I just wanted you to stop living in it." The words hung between them, deep but healing. They didn't need to say much more. They both knew that the hardest part was already behind them. When the plates were cleared, Mark reached for her hand. "Dance with me," he said softly. She hesitated for a second, then smiled. Here, he said. He pulled her close, and they began to move slowly to the music. It wasn't perfect. His steps were clumsy, and she laughed when he nearly tripped, but that was the beauty of it. For the first time in years, laughter filled their home, effortless and free. As they swayed, Claire rested her head on his shoulder. The rhythm of his heartbeat steadied her. In that simple embrace, she felt years of distance melting away. Every apology they hadn't said, every quiet ache they'd ignored it, was all there, but no longer painful. It had turned into understanding, Mark whispered. You know, when I first planned this night, I thought it would be about us starting over. But now I think it's more about us remembering why we started it all. Claire smiled through the tears that began to gather in her eyes. You always did know what to say, she murmured. They danced until the song ended, then kept holding each other as silence filled the space. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just the soft truth of two people choosing each other again. Later, they sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the night sky. The rain had stopped completely, and the moonlight spilled across the yard. Claire leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if David never came back? Mark thought for a moment. I think we would have kept moving, like we were careful, polite, but half alive. Sometimes it takes a storm to remind you how much sunlight matters. She smiled. That's a very poetic way of saying I needed a wake-up call. He chuckled. Maybe we both did. There was comfort in their honesty. No bitterness, no blame, just two people owning the truth and finally freeing themselves from it. The next morning, the world felt new. Claire woke early, made coffee, and stood by the window as the first light touched the horizon. Mark joined her quietly, slipping his arms around her waist. I've been thinking, he said. Maybe we should take that trip you always wanted. Maine, the coast, those quiet cabins by the sea. She turned to face him. You remembered that? Of course I did, he said with a small grin. You talked about it every autumn. You said you wanted to see the sunrise over the Atlantic at least once? Her eyes softened. I think I'd like that. A fresh start by the ocean. He nodded. Then it's settled. We'll go next week. The decision wasn't about escaping it, was about beginning again. This time as equals, not as people haunted by what dash if stot in the days that followed. Claire found herself smiling more, laughing at small things, humming while she cooked. She didn't notice it at first, but Mark did. The light had returned to her, and when he caught her writing again something she hadn't done in years, he didn't interrupt. He just watched, grateful. One afternoon, she handed him a folded page. I've been writing about everything that happened, she said shyly. Not to dwell on it, but to remember how far we've come. He read the first line aloud. Sometimes love doesn't fade, it just waits for you to find the courage to see it again. He looked up, eyes soft. That's beautiful, Claire. It's true, she said simply. Their trip to Maine was quiet, almost dreamlike. They drove along winding roads, stopped at small diners, talked about nothing and everything. On their second night, they sat by the shore watching the waves crash under the moonlight. Claire leaned her head on Mark's shoulder and whispered, You know, it's funny. I used to think closure came from people, but now I realize it comes from peace. Mark smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then I'm glad you found both. The ocean roared softly around them, endless and alive. It felt like a mirror of their story, once turbulent. Now calm. As dawn broke the next morning, the sky painted itself in soft pinks and golds. Claire stood barefoot on the sand, feeling the cold water touch her toes. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and whispered, Thank you, to no one in particular. Maybe to the past. Maybe to the present. Maybe to herself. Mark came up behind her and slipped his hand into hers. Ready to go? She nodded. Ready for everything. As they walked back toward the cabin, the light of the rising sun followed them. Long shadows stretching behind proof that the past would always be part of them. But it no longer controlled the path ahead. For the first time in years, Claire felt whole. Not because of closure, not because of perfection, but because she'd finally learned that love isn't about rewriting what's gone. It's about choosing what stays. And when Mark looked at her one last time before they left the beach, he didn't see the woman lost in memories anymore. He saw his wife, his partner, standing fully in the moment, finally alive again. That night, as they drove home under the starlit sky, Mark reached for her hand and said, "You know, I didn't just plan that night to remind you of the past. I planned it to show you that our story was never over." Claire smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "And now," she said softly, "it never will be." The road ahead stretched endlessly, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, a quiet promise of new beginnings.